Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 394 and my guest is Charles McCutcheon. Charles is recovering from a double lung transplant as a result of long COVID. He's a music industry veteran and has worked with absolute legends. Mind-blowing. He was born in Ireland, he lives in Nashville, and he has traveled many miles and had many adventures in between. I've known Charles a really long time. I adore him and his wife Alicia. I'm really excited to share this, and I'm so happy that his transplant was a success and that he's on the road to recovery and on the mend. I mean, my gosh, what an experience that he had to endure, and what a blessing that it's that thing of, you know, out of one person's tragedy comes another person's miracle. And it's a stark reminder of how precious life is all around. Okay, check out heyhumanpodcast.com for links and to learn more about my guests and the show. Check out susanruth.com to learn more about me and my other artistic endeavors. Follow Susan Ruthism and Hey Human Podcast on social media. Find my albums on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever you get your music. And by the way, I just realized the other day, I've had Hey Human Podcast on iHeart for many years, and I got this little voice in my head saying, check your iHeart. And I did, and it wasn't on there. So I re-put it on there. For those of you who are used to iHeart podcasts, you can find it again. It is there. I don't know what happened. There was a glitch in the matrix, but it is back, baby. Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes, iHeart, wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify. It's in all the places. Well, mostly all the places. Thank you for listening. Be well, be kind, stay healthy, be love, and here we go. Hi.
Hi. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you, honey?
Good. Well, better than I was a few months ago.
Yes, I know. Such a crazy story. You look great.
Well, I feel as if I'm getting stronger and better and fitter. It's very strange because I'm literally on 6 foot tall, 72 inches, as they say on my medical chart. I am at the moment 157 pounds in weight, which is skinny for a 6 foot human, as you would say. But when I had my transplant on September the 2nd, I was 126 pounds. So I literally was. I say to people when they ask me about the qualification process and the protocols and whatever, the thing that nearly knocked me out at the end from being a candidate and getting transplanted was body mass index. And they will not transplant a person if their mass index, their BMI, falls below 70.5 is the cutoff, and I was 18.2. So I was heading downwards in terms of BMI for the previous year and a half. So they warned me straight up, that I wouldn't have made it through Christmas, the New Year, with the deterioration as it was happening at that speed and in those circumstances. So I was very lucky to get through it and get transplanted and get the call and then transplanted at the time I was.
Yeah, well, we're going to get into all of that. First, let me welcome you. Charles McCutcheon, welcome to Hey Human.
Hi.
Hi, love. You're a dear friend. We've known each other a long time.
We have, and it's been a wonderful process just seeing how you've evolved as well.
Well, I appreciate that. But we're here to talk about you. So let's get into it. Tell us a little bit about your background and where you grew up, childhood, where you came from, what brought you here.
I'm Irish by birth and was born in Omagh in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland, and lived there. I was the youngest of 7 children. I lived with my family, and my father and mother decided to relocate to England, back into the UK, when I was 5 years old, which was 1960. And I grew up in the English military school system because my father had gone back into the Royal Air Force from a very, very poor situation in Ireland after the Second World War, where there literally, like a lot of countries across Europe, there was a devastation of industry, a devastation of farms and livelihoods and whatever. So literally, my father had to make a difficult decision, but in retrospect, a brilliant decision to go back into. He was invited to go back into the military in 1959 as both a mechanical engineer, but also because he was one of the RAF pipe majors. So he ran a number of Royal Air Force pipes and drum bands, and there were very few of them. So he spent the last 20 years of his military life being pipe major to the Royal Air Force pipe band in England and in Germany. So we went to live in England, and then we ended up living in Lancashire, up in the north of England, near Manchester and Liverpool. And then we moved south down into near London, in Bedfordshire. And in between, we were sent off to Germany twice, and for a few years each time. And so, cutting a long story short, I grew up in England. I lost my Irishness very early on, which children tend to do when they're relocated at a young age. You know, the accent goes and their mannerisms and things go. But I just became very English very, very early on.
Yeah, your accent is, one might consider, posh, or on the echelon of poshness.
Yeah, I was partly because I was kicked off to, boarding school at a young age, and that was really full of obviously military children, and that tended to be a lot of children who were in fact a lot better off than we were, but just the mannerisms and the colloquialisms and the language and the accents and whatever. Just it rubs off on children very, very early on, as you know. So I really, from the ages of like 9 to 15, 16, when I was at boarding school, I became very UK child, and my Irish accent had gone a long time ago. So, I've enjoyed it, but suffered from it as well over the decades since, because it's just, it confuses people as to where I'm from. And I'm forever having to explain that I'm Irish, 100% Irish. Don't ask me to 23-3 me or whatever it is, because I know what it is. It's 99.9999, Irish. So it's that's my history and my background.
Did you go to boarding school with your siblings as well, or did you get sent on your own?
I went to boarding school in Germany, two different, a boys' boarding school and a girls' boarding school. My sister Isabel went to the girls' boarding school. Being the youngest, by the time I was like 8, 9, 10 years old, my elder brothers and sisters were, in their late teens, early 20s. You tend to be isolated as a younger child in that kind of large family, particularly if you're moving around to different locations every 3 or 4 years when your father is moved to different camps and different postings. From the ages of 10 onwards, from being at boarding school and whatever, you do learn a certain element of independence. And that helps you, even though it's a bit boring at the time because you miss your siblings. In later life, it gives you a sense of strength and independence that you can rely upon, and you learn to stand on your own 2 feet, very, very quickly. And it introduced me to my own love of music, even though as youngsters in the family, we were always encouraged. The girls were always encouraged to play the piano or the accordion, and the boys were always instructed to learn how to play the pipes or the drums. So by the time we got to England in the early 60s, I lucked out. We fell flat on our face right in the middle of Beatlemania. So, I did not have to learn how to play the bagpipes well, even though I can get by on them.
2 questions. Did you enjoy your time at boarding school on an emotional level? I understand it, the rigors of it, or the independence facilitating part of it you enjoyed, but did you experience a good feeling? And my other question is, did being Irish, did you have a sense of, because we know that there is animosity that happens Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England. And I'm curious if any of that figured into any of your decision to either let go of an accent or try to appear to be British.
Well, in answering your first question about going to boarding school and how it affected me and that stuff, I really I enjoyed it, but I think in later life you tend to look back at things with rose-colored glasses, and you remember the great bits and the good times. But I do know there were times of stress and times of loneliness and times of abandonment in some respects. And I think that a lot of kids feel that until they really get their sea legs and they find out that, you can sit there and feel abandoned and you can feel left alone or whatever as much as you want, but you're in exactly the same boat as everybody else in that school, particularly when it's like I went to a forces boarding school in Germany. So every other pupil there, was from a forces family of some distinction or level or whatever. So we were all basically in the same boat in terms of, there had to be an element of support because we all understood that we were all going to just be mates or friends for the next 2 or 3 years. And then we're all going to go our separate ways anyway. And there's a lovely thing on one of the school I went to in Germany, which was called Windsor Boys School in Ham in the Ruhr. One of the things that popped up on their website last year was that there was a wonderful study about how a child that went to a military boarding school actually makes and loses and moves on from more close friendships in the first 18 years of their lives, generally than any other comparable element of children time passages, so that you meet so many people that you become friends with early on, but they're gone from your life within 2 or 3 years unless you have the opportunity to stay in touch later on, or you end up moving to another station somewhere in the world that they happen to be. So there was an element of loneliness, but it also there's an immense sense of community at particularly forces boarding school, because it's not based upon status. It's not based upon social conditioning. It's not based upon how much money your parents have or whatever, or what they're paying for the school. Everybody there is a military brat. There's a balancing act between, getting on with people or trying to be, the top of the heap. And I never found that. But I also found that, I was incredibly lucky at being good at sport and also good at music and stuff. So I really wasn't bullied, And the other thing was I was the youngest of a family of 7. So by the time, just to survive being the youngest of a family at 7, you learn how to take care of yourself, or they teach you how to take care of yourself. So I never, ever experienced one element of bullying or anything like that, or any unsettling behavior at the schools that I could reflect on and say that it was not managed or it was damaging. It really wasn't. But the one thing that did surprise me, to allude to your second question, is that with the Irish, Scottish, and the Welsh delineation, let's call it, from the English, that really, as anyone will know, that basically is the result of wars and invasion and imposition and such. But when we first came across from Ireland to England, for example, I had never seen a black person in my life. They just, God bless them, they had not made it to the Irish island where we lived. So I literally, at school in Lancashire, for my very first school, my kindergarten, I suppose you'd call it, literally two of my closest friends for a number of years after that were 2 Jamaican boys. who their parents had come across to England from the Caribbean and from Jamaica in the 50s for economic reasons and whatever, and they just assimilated into British life. They were my first friends, but I'd never seen any black people in my life before. But the other thing, that was a kind of a happy coincidence, a happy situation that I fell into and enjoyed immensely. When I was old enough to understand it, I also experienced the other side of that pendulum, which was the utter hatred that existed towards not only the immigrant West Indian population, the immigrants from, at that time, were predominantly either Indian or they were West Indian from the Caribbean. But there used to be, there were signs in shops and places like that actually said, no blacks, no Jews, no Irish, and no dogs. So, and I literally, I have to this day a photo of one of those signs that existed in England. I should say, not Great Britain, but in England in those early days of the 60s. And it was a prevalent attitude. So it wasn't just discrimination against one particular color, but there was a racial discrimination against Irish and Jews and poor dogs as well. So it was incredibly difficult for, I think, the adult population of a lot of economic immigrants who came to England in those days, because there was such a superiority attitude from the English to, as they say, keep England white. So we did, as being Irish, we felt that. We really did feel that you were isolated in communities that were predominantly Irish, or your friends were. I mean, I look back on it, and realized that I had so many Jewish friends and I had so many West Indian friends that it didn't seem anything but normal to me. But I realized later, as I learned about the delinquent history, let's say, it was just viral through the English nation that there should be that discrimination. And I do believe that it's got an awful lot better and much, 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 much kinder and more decent and evolved. But it is certainly, there are still pockets, there are still, and we know that around the world, but I think it's, you focus in on seeing it in your own community. So yes, we did feel that there was exclusion. And indeed, one thing that gets Irish people through that whole situation is the fact that we can add a layer of humor to any circumstances whatsoever. I don't care what happens in someone's life, we have a joke about it. So it's generally self-deprecating, and it's to take away the sting and the stain of what it could be perceived as being if you let it affect you.
What facilitated your discovery of America and decision to come to America?
Well, that's another funny story, because being Irish, we love our music. We can find an excuse to have any kind of party or ceilidh, and there's always music. It's one of the funny things I say to people now, because I've played the guitar and written songs and sung for years and years and years, but I always lighten things up by saying, I know that I'm a folk singer, because every time I stood up at family gatherings to sing, my father used to go, "Oh, folk." At least I think that's the word he used. So really, I got involved literally after high school. I was supposed to go to military college when I was 19 years old. And I'd been accepted, and I was heading off down a military career path, which I was very excited about, because I always wanted to fly, and I lived on Air Force camps all my life. So I was surrounded by aircraft and aviation and engineering and whatever. So that was really my love of doing it. But cutting a very long story short, when I was waiting to I had to wait a year before going to military college. And a friend of mine got me an interview with a record label in London. And the only reason I got the interview was because I was the only person that he knew well who knew anything about music. He only got me the interview because he was trying to make himself look good in the eyes of his boss. He was working in the recruitment business. I was fulfilling a need for him, but it actually set me on a destiny course that I could never have expected as a young boy. So I ended up working for a feeder label called UK Records, part of the Decca Records group, which is probably then with EMI the biggest label group in the UK. I had no ambition of ever getting through an interview. You just feel at that age that there's going to be an enormous amount of people far better qualified than you who are going to get, pre-selected and also, quite frankly, live closer and are more convenient. So I never expected to get the job, but I did by fluke. And then I went on to record promotion for UK Records for about a year before they realized that I was a crap record promotion guy. But I was actually quite good at dealing with the press and with the media. Jonathan King, who owned the label, got me into Decca Records as an assistant press officer when I was 20 years old. So I was incredibly lucky. And Decca was an amazing label to work for, where we had some extraordinary. Stones were still on Decca in those days, there was some remarkable people, remarkable bands, and I took to being a publicist and being a press officer like the proverbial duck to water. I just loved it, and also because I went in there knowing a lot about what alternative music is now, and also I knew an awful lot about folk music and country music because I was Irish. That was the music we listened to. I ended up leaving Decca. I was headhunted and went to work at Warner Brothers as a press officer, which had even better artists, incredible people. Crosby, Stills, Nash were just, ZZ Top, Joni Mitchell, just extraordinary artists. The Doobie Brothers had just been launched. I was there, and they started to work with a number of artists coming out of the States, coming over to Europe, and out of Nashville in particular. I was working with some extraordinarily cool people at Warner Brothers. Just loved it there. But once they found out that I knew a lot about country music, I became the go-to country music person. And so literally at 21, 22 years old, they were sending me over to America because no one else, they were all too damn cool for school to be seen anywhere near Little Feat, or some of the other artists. It was just, Jimmy Buffett. They had no idea what to do with someone like that. I really got to know Nashville pretty early on in my life, in my career. So, and I loved it. And I started to get a reputation in England and Europe as being a country music, an alternative music PR. Again, because everyone wanted to work, with the great English bands, and they missed out so much. When people originally thought that Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were a country band, Poco was a country band, and it was to my benefit. And then I got offered a job working in independent PR, and I left Warner Brothers to go to work for an independent PR company. But I was working with The Who, I was working with Deep Purple, I was working with, Uriah Heep, I was working with Leo Sayer. And some extraordinary people. Mark Bolan before he died. I was in Status Quo, one of my favorite bands in the world. So I kind of bailed out from corporate Warner Brothers and went to work independently. But then when I was working independently, ABC Records in London came along and said, we know we're not going to try and drag you away from being independent, but would you run our press department, publicity department at the same time? And I thought, well, I know I can do it, but I'm going to have to just get permission. My two bosses, two of the greatest PRs in music history in England, in Keith Altham in particular, who's been the number one music PR in Great Britain literally all his life. He said yes. And he said, off you go and do it. He said, we'll give you all the support we can. So I ended up getting very involved with ABC, and obviously ABC Dot Records in Nashville was a huge country label, and we launched a bunch of artists. With people like Don Williams. We had like 7 or 8 or 10 gold platinum albums in Europe with him, and Billy Joe Spears. We sold 3 gold albums, and Freddie Fender. We had a big success with him. over there. And so I love that because it also got me involved with some great blues and R&B artists. And I had great fun working with B.B. King in particular, with, Harold Melvin, the Blue Notes, the Chi-Lites, the Four Tops, who were just so much fun on tour and just great, great people. So it was, and I was very, very lucky. So I got to know Nashville really, really early on. And then Jim Halsey, the manager entrepreneur from Tulsa, had the Jim Halsey Company, which was the biggest country music management group in America. And then he asked me to run his London office. So, I had a lot of hats, but they were all interconnected and they were all of benefit to each and every one. So I started to spend a lot of time in Nashville. And this is all the way through the 70s into the start of the 80s. I was married in 75, but sadly my wife and I divorced, literally because we kind of lost touch with each other. I was away so much, so often. We became different people. It's not something I'm, desperately proud of, but if what had not happened in the way that it happened, then I wouldn't have met my wife currently. I would not have met Alicia. And that was in Nashville.
And we love Alicia.
I know. Gosh, she is probably your biggest fan in the world. And
I love her so much. She's so great.
My life would have been somewhat emptier without having those opportunities to be here in Nashville, in the USA. It was all meant for a reason. And you know me, I'm a big believer in faith. And I do believe that you follow where you're led. And that's what, part of it was just dumb luck. I know it was. Part of it was just, oh, shit, that sounds good. I'll do that.
But that's saying yes. That's saying yes when the opportunity arises, because a lot of people don't say yes. They start to overthink or think, oh, I don't know how to do this, or what happens if this happens, and they worry about all the things, but you leap in.
Oh, I do both feet. And I try not to do it stupidly, but I have done it stupidly on a couple of occasions and landed flat on my face. So
sure.
And that's just a process of learning and, dusting yourself off. And every success story has a massive failures attached to it, whether people like it or not. And Nashville and England and France literally then became home for Alicia and myself for years and years. So we had a beautiful, charmed life. But it was, it's only charmed when you work hard at it. That's what I found. I know people talk about, luck and this and that and the other, but, what do they say? That I became luckier the harder I worked.
Yes. Yes. My father has a saying, opportunity knocks, it doesn't nag.
Yeah, no, I love that. An opportunity are very fickle. You start, thumbing your nose at it. It doesn't stay around long.
That's very true. I imagine with all of these bands, your stories must be incredible. You must have a vault of the wildest story.
I mean, the highlights of my life when I was an independent PR, when I left ABC, because I just, they were going through this corporate, a restructure in the early 80s and whatever. And it just was becoming, everything you wanted to do became a meeting. And it was like, I'm like a lot of people of my background in this industry. Meetings should be 5 minutes.
Agreed.
I didn't want to do the corporate thing. And also, in the mid-70s, I became very friendly with Stephen Bishop, the singer-songwriter. And Stephen was a great friend of Eric Clapton's and Patty Boyd, his wife. And consequently, Eric and Patty became good friends of mine. And then I started to work for Eric. I got involved at Warner Brothers with George Harrison's Dark Horse label through Derek Taylor, who was the head of special projects at Warner's, but he'd also been the Beatles PR for 15 years. So I'm incredibly lucky, to get involved with those people and to be accepted and to be welcomed. So I was really, and loads of things that thankfully I kept a diary and a journal. So I managed to recall and remember and keep many of them written down. And I've been actually very, very lax in having the confidence to actually write them all out and do a book and things like that. And I think half of that is because I come from very humble background. So, there's always this, keep your feet on the ground and do not go down that road of self-aggrandizement and stuff like that. You see so much that you should and would and will and have to be confidential is not the word I would use, but you have to be respectful. There's a lot of people who are extraordinarily successful artists now went through a lot of weird, horrible stuff. And so it's important not to be seen to be profiting from that kind of stuff. And I've kept away from writing, articles and books and things like that, because I love these people, and they took care of me, and they were brilliant friends. I'm doing something for the family. The one story that I would never leave out of anything I wrote was the fact that until I met Keith Moon, I never drank alcohol. I was a sports fanatic, but when I went into independent PR with Keith Altham, I think he kind of just, kicked me over to Keith Moon because he wanted to get rid of Keith. So he said, like, no, you'll be responsible for him. And I did not drink. And there was an album out in 76 or something like that. It was called The Who by Numbers. And we were doing the PR for that. And I had to do a day of interviews with Keith, which was always in a pub or always in a bar somewhere. So I just rounded up a whole bunch of my journalist friends from the music press and the national press, and we just met Keith in a pub. It's called the Brewmaster Pub in Leicester Square in England, and we just played snooker and pool for the whole afternoon. But Keith was determined that everyone was going to have a drink, and I literally, it was the first time after knowing him for a year or so that he found out that I didn't drink. And so he basically, in front of everybody, threatened to kill me if I didn't drink. And he then lined up every drink in the pub, on the bar, in little shot glasses, and was just stood there and said, we're staying here, and we're going to find something you like to drink, or I will kill you. His exact words were, I'm not going to have a PR working with me who doesn't drink. It would be disastrous. So literally, manfully, I had to, I literally had a sip of every damn thing on the bar. And to my utter horror, and to his utter horror, and my disgrace, the only thing that I found that I liked was called cherry brandy. He thought the most appalling thing that he'd ever heard in his life. And I only liked that because my mother used to drink it at Christmas. She loved a glass of her cherry brandy. So at least I tasted it, so I knew what was coming. But literally after, I never drank until that day. And then I started, I drink a beer shandy, which was, an English beer with some lemonade on it, which is very, very refreshing, I have to say. And then literally I drank wine for most of my life. So, it was, there are some incredible life-changing stories.
See, that's a great story, and it hurts no one, I feel like. And John Velasco, our mutual friend, always says, you can write about anyone once they're dead, but you can write about it from your own personal experience, not throw them under the bus or tell tales out of school, but how it shaped you individually as a person to be in the orbits of these people.
I know. There's John Velasco and I are both waiting for certain people to pass away.
Yeah. Boy, does he have stories. I got to get him on the show, but he won't spill the tea either.
No, he and I worked at Jet Records in London together. I did some independent PR for Jet when ELO were on the label, and Roy Wood and Wizard and a whole bunch of other people. They were owned by a remarkable guy, lethal man called Don Arden, who is Sharon Osbourne's father. And Sharon, who was then Sharon Arden in those days, she left the family home basically to go off and to manage Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. And John and I worked at Jet Records at the same time, and we often sit, even with Alicia sitting with us, we just look at each other and say, there'll come a day when we can tell some of these stories. So
Oh, yeah. I've heard a few of the Black Sabbath stories from John. My lips are sealed, but oh my Lord.
There are others. I think
Legendary. Maybe the two of you could write a book together. It will just be incredible.
can you imagine? I mean, just it's life defining, some of those things, and
yeah,
they're incredibly funny, but also some of them are just demonstratively tragic as well, when you see what happened to some of the people who were as consequences of some of the tragedy that happened.
Keith being a good example.
Oh God, I know. Well, less than 2 years after he was, trying to pour alcohol down my throat, he died on a sofa. It was incredibly sad, and he was the loveliest, kindest person. I mean, you always wanted him as a friend. You did not want him teed off at you, but he was an incredibly kind, decent person. You got to remember those people like Keith Moon and the Who, and a lot of those stellar English rock guitarists and drummers and bassists and whatever. They were stars from their 16s and 17s, from their late teens. They were genius from the time when people over here and in England were thinking of finishing high school. So it was just that. And of course, Keith also died when he was 27. The age
27 club, yeah.
Yeah. So, and that kind of freaked me out for a little while. I was like, good God, how many more? So it's but I found them to be incredibly kind, and incredibly decent and lovely people. The majority, 90% of the artists that certainly I worked with and I was involved with were lovely, lovely, kind people, but just insanely talented.
As someone who grew up surrounded by Beatlemania, can you tell a quick synopsis of what that was like to be around?
Well, I remember I was like 10 years old when A Hard Day's Night and Help and stuff like that came out. And my sister was a certifiable Beatle lunatic. I mean, she wasn't just a fan. She was absolutely obsessed with the Beatles. At 10 years old as a boy, I was kind of, I love my music and things like that, but I literally was, there was other bands that were coming along at that time. I was, Buddy Holly was huge. Roy Orbison had just had big hits in the UK, and the Dave Clark Five were just starting off. In fact, the Dave Clark Five were signed to Decca in the early 60s as a preference to Decca signing the Beatles. So it was, there's all these incredible bands coming along, and I think, because my father was very involved in organizing entertainment at the RAF camps that we lived on, my sisters and I and my brothers got to meet quite a lot of artists. So, you gravitate towards those that you meet, and they have to have an impact on you. So the Beatlemania for me didn't get going literally until I went to boarding school in Germany, and my mother bought me a copy of Rubber Soul. And I suddenly realized, first of all, they weren't going away. And secondly, they weren't just a girly band. But Beatlemania was so top to bottom in terms of the community of Great Britain and Europe. It was really, even though they would deny it, people like my parents loved the Beatles. They truly, truly did. My mum was a huge George Harrison fan. She just thought he was adorable. Of course, every mother loved Paul. But Beatlemania was obsession, but it was backed up by the fact that these guys weren't going away, and they were writing some incredible stuff, and they seemed to all be the kind of people that you'd like to meet, and so it was. But my sister was, when A Hard Day's Night came out, she was basically my caregiver in those days, because I was quite young. But she dragged me and my friend along to see A Hard Day's Night 11 times in 6 days.
Oh my God.
That's what Beatlemania was. And the only reason we saw it 11 times in 6 days was because, we'd have enough money for one of us to get in. And then that one would go and open the fire door at the other end of the theater so that we could sneak in the other three. And then between shows, because there was such a quick changeover, we were small enough to hide under the seats so that the security wouldn't be able to find us. So we could stay in and watch another one. So
I love that.
it was 11 times at the Bedford Granada Cinema. My sister dragged me along to see A Hard Day's Night.
Wow. I feel like in modern day speak that the Swifties and their devotion to Taylor Swift is comparable.
Oh, indeed. And maybe even more so, because the Swifties have a lot more disposable income at their we had to use all sort of subterfuge and means by which to circumvent the fact that we were all broke. We were just kids who got, some of the young children, when they were at school in England, every Monday you would actually go to school where your parents would give you what was called dinner money. So you had to every Monday give your dinner money in for your school lunches during the week. And it tends to add up. In those days, it was like 5 shillings, which is a good amount of money for a child. There were so many children during Beatlemania who were claiming that they were going home for school lunch, that they didn't give their school lunch money in, including me and my sister, so that we would be able to save that money up to be able to go and do things that we wanted at the weekend, like get into cinemas and like buy records and things like that. So there was an underground deal going on with kids who knew what to do, but it was rumbled because there were so many children not having school lunches that they realized that something must be going on somewhere, because you just couldn't have 3/4 of the kids going home this year for lunch that weren't going home for lunch the previous year. Half the reason they could do it also is because they lived close to the school. There was no school busing and stuff like that until later on or whatever. So you tend to walk or ride your bicycle to school. So it was Beatlemania caused all sorts of mayhem in families. But the Swifties now, good Lord, their parents and their uncles and cousins and whatever are paying $2,000 for a ticket. The whole emphasis that you're talking about is the same.
Right. And Taylor Swift, brilliant move on the movie theaters, not unlike the Hard Day's Night or Help, the way the Beatles made their movie. It's a genius plan, really.
Yeah, it is. But you have to have, I don't understand why, I've never understood why the Beatles could pull off the movie business where other bands couldn't, where the Stones couldn't, where the Kinks couldn't, and where other artists just couldn't do it. Cliff Richard in England, who was our version of Elvis Presley, and a genius talent himself, was probably the only other teen idol singer in Great Britain in those days who had successful movies. Indeed, asked that question, particularly of Derek Taylor, who was the Beatles PR in those early days. And then I worked with him at Warner Brothers. And he just said they got the price right. They shot the movies in less than 3 months. I mean, you just can't imagine that. It was basically just a hodgepodge of storyline and editing. But they got them in and got them out whilst the fire was still burning, if you see what I mean. So that
Yellow Submarine must have taken some time.
Yeah, because they did that themselves.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the idiosyncrasies of our business is that everyone looking out from the outside looking in, there was always this perception that, if you were a pop star, if you were a rock star, you were basically loaded and you had an awful lot of money. And that certainly was not true whatsoever. It took maybe an average of 20 years for each of those artists to realize that they weren't spending the record label's money, they were spending their own money.
Yeah, it's a very expensive loan.
Yeah.
60% loan or something crazy.
Well, and also the fact that you pay all the money back through your royalties.
That's what I mean. It's a very pricey. If a label gave you $1 million, people don't understand that you have to pay that money back, but the label takes their money off the top first, and then whatever earnings you make, that's where your payback comes from. So it's really you're drowning from the get-go.
But also, to my mind, when I started to learn a little bit more about intellectual copyright and misuse, the thing that always devastated my head was that they give you $1 million and you make the record and you go out and you promote it and you sell and blah, 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 and you pay it back before you earn any more money, but they still own the record. I mean, that to me was just extraordinary. It was right. I always use the analogy of it was like going to a bank and borrowing £1 million to buy a house, building the house, putting the roof on, and paying the money back to the bank, but they still own the house. That to me did not make any sense whatsoever. And luckily, what happened with major rock artists, and I'm talking jumping forward to the mid '80s. I'm talking about significant stars, like Clapton, like the Beatles, like Elton John, who were basically, in terms of what you would call wealthy, they were broke. Anything they wanted, the record labels would buy for them and give to them, but that just went on their account and they had to repay it.
Yeah.
It wasn't until obviously CDs came along, and CDs had not been included in any previous recording contracts, that they were offered legally the right to renegotiate and start to be paid decent royalties. And that's what made them wealthy.
And then, of course, the labels caught on and made 360 deals. And so then they were back to square one, of course. With just a few artists like Springsteen, who maintained his own intellectual property, owning the masters of all his records. And I think Dylan eventually bought back his records. Yeah. But I think Springsteen had his masters from the start.
Yeah, well, this is it. There was a lot of, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but there's a lot of a difference between a lot of artists, Jagger and the Stones, after it got to like 68, 69, they realized that they had to change their whole situation financially in order to protect themselves, because they had no money. And it was also a time when bands like Pink Floyd were coming out. There were great artists coming out of the universities, and a lot of the university guys had a much better education than a lot of the original pop star bands who came out from basically being teens and straight into the cesspit of that industry. And so it was only until, I always call it the Pink Floyd phenomenon and the Jagger phenomenon. I mean, Mick Jagger went to the London School of Economics and had a degree from there. So he finally realized that unless they get this under control, they're never going to make any money. A lot of the bands realized that with CDs coming up, they had something to work with and something to negotiate with. But also what they did is, and I know this because I spent years working with Deep Purple, who were then in the 70s probably the biggest selling band in the world. And I know for a fact that the Deep Purple business model, by necessity, had to be built around touring and had to be built around merchandise, because that's one area where they could control the inflow of income and therefore give themselves a chance to at least be solvent, because they certainly weren't making it out of selling 1 million records.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, modern day artists, I suppose, in schools like Belmont University, where they teach music business, where that's an actual degree of art for artists, even, yeah, that they learn from others' mistakes. Somebody like a Kenny Chesney, who came out, I think he went to Belmont, came out with a marketing degree. Or no, he went to MTSU, maybe? I know he was somewhere in Tennessee, but he came out of that with this marketing plan for himself and has stayed true to it, and it has served him quite well, obviously. Yeah. Taylor Swift is another great example. Although she didn't go to school for it, she certainly understood from a young age the importance of marketing.
One of the things that we did for a lot of artists in certainly the 70s and the 80s through into the 90s was that we persuaded, against a lot of pushback, I have to say, we persuaded a lot of artists to invoke their re-recording rights. Because in the original 50s, 60s, 70s record deals, there wasn't a break in terms of the labels owned the masters, and that was it, perpetuity. But then a number of artists, it started with the Dave Clark Five, and Dave Clark was one of the artists in England, very first, to do lease tape deals. And he did like 3 and 5 year deals for lease tapes, where the label would have them ownership for marketing rights for certain territories for a period of 3 to 5 years, with a sell-off period afterwards of maybe a year. But then the rights reverted back to the artists. But then the labels caught wind of that, so they started to give the artists a bit more money, and they increased the terms of the contracts for where they couldn't get it outright from the start. They increased the terms of the contracts where they'd have a 5-year or a 7-year exclusive,
or by album, or a 10 album.
Yeah, exactly, and that's how that all evolved. But then after that, the artists had a re-recording right. And the whole theory of the industry was that no one in their right mind was going to be interested in a song that was recorded 5 or 7 years ago. Anything in the future was just going to be new artists. There was going to be a new Beatles. There was going to be a new Stones. There was going to be a new this.
Yeah, Taylor Swift says, "Hold my beer," and re-records every record. I love it.
And I think that is perfectly right and proper for artists to do. I mean, if we were living in the Renaissance period, you'd have people like me going to painters going, paint another one, do the same one, do it 10 times over, because it's the only way that you can protect your income and your livelihood. Can you imagine those? Can you imagine how much, Vincent van Gogh wouldn't have been chopping his ear off and shooting himself in a field, if he'd been able to earn money from his work to the degree that it is now. Well, let's say overused. Yeah.
All right, let's toggle to, and I appreciate all these stories. This is so wonderful. Let's talk about your lungs, love. Let's go through that journey. Tell me how that started and where it ended up.
Well, it partly goes back to life in music as well, and the entertainment business, because I made a choice early on. I was never going to smoke. First, primarily, not because I was being pious. A lot of the kids that I went to school with, and this is no different than any other young person. You make a decision and you have an opinion about it. And I just didn't like half the kids that smoked. So I wasn't doing it for any, perceived forward-thinking medical reason or anything like that. I just, that wasn't my clan, and they smelt all the time. So I just didn't. That wasn't for me. So, and also I didn't take drugs. Spend a life in music, and I am not, Mr. Clean, fancy, this, that. I'm just not. I've had fun. I've had a great time, but I just chose not to take drugs, primarily because, early on in my career, I saw what it did to a bunch of people. One of my dearest friends, who I got to know over a number of years, from the band Badfinger, who, signed to Apple, they're just brilliant. I mean, they do the majority of the backing vocals and the instruments on George's All Things Must Pass album. And Peter Ham, who was in Badfinger, great singer-songwriter, who co-wrote the Nielsen hit Without You. Peter, in a state of depression, hung himself. Going back to not having any money, having sold 5 million records by the time he was 28 or something like that, both as a songwriter and as a performer, had no money, and he ended up hanging himself. And the same thing happened with Tommy Evans, his co-writer on Without You, who was also a member of Badfinger. Then with Keith Moon, dying his way. And then with Deep Purple, when Tommy Bolin, the guitarist, joined, he replaced Ritchie Blackmore in Deep Purple. And Tommy died in a drug overdose in a vomiting state in Florida. So, and there was a bunch of people who were just keeling over, and it just scared me. I just did not want to do it. Have I been a little high? Yeah, I think so, because I've spent half my life in backstage and dressing rooms and things like that. But I've never wanted to do any of that stuff. So, cutting forward to your question about the lung situation, is Alicia and I went for a medical in 2019. The previous year, my medical had been fine. I had no issue. I'd been always very fit as an adult. The doctors noticed some clouding on one of my lungs, on my left lung, which had not been there before. They sent me for some CT scans. They thought that there was some sort of fibrotic problem with the lung. And this was just at the time when COVID was just raising its ugly head, just before the full-blown COVID blow of 2020. And then in early 2020, I had a very, very bad bout of gastric issues. And this is before they were identifying gastric issues as being an identifier for COVID. So, and no one wanted me to go to the hospital. They didn't want you didn't want to be intubated for a start. And so the doctors at St. Thomas's, where I was here in Nashville, basically said after the high res scans of my lungs, they came back and said, you have idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF, which is basically, my naivety, I said, well, yeah, hey, what does that mean? And they went, and as straight as a die, they went 3 to 5 years, which stopped me in my tracks slightly. And because you know her, I'll explain to you that this call from the doctor happened in the car when I was driving with Alicia.
Oh my God!
But I had the phone on earpieces, so she could only hear my part of the conversation. So, with the doctor having told me that I had 3 to 5 years to live max, I basically said to him, "Well, that doesn't sound good. What's the next steps?" So, and I just went, yes, fine. At which point, put the phone down. Alicia said, "What was that all about?" And because you know her, you'll understand this. But I didn't tell her for 2 weeks. I said that was just the doctor setting me up for another CT scan. After 2 weeks of Alicia saying, "What's going on? What's going on? What's going on?" I finally had to admit to her that it was that what he'd said. So she dragged me kicking and screaming back into him and the doctor and said, I hear what you're saying. Don't believe it. Want a second opinion. He very kindly and very supportively said, I don't think we have the facilities here at St. Thomas that would do you justice. And would you mind if I recommended a colleague of mine at the Vanderbilt Lung Institute? And so he did. So he got me into the Vanderbilt Lung Institute, and they did their battery of tests and checks, and they came back and said, we're not absolutely certain that you have the full-blown IPF, but you certainly have something called non-specific interstitial pneumonia, which is kind of the same thing, but it's just not as deadly and lethal. And would you be interested in coming into our lung and pulmonary study to get even better, deeper care and resources for this? So I said yes. They said the only drawback to it is that if you come into it, you can only come into it and get the support we can supply if you agree to go into the lung transplant program, which I thought was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard in my life. I was going, what? You kind of go, moi? That's not going to happen. But yeah, if I have to do it, I'll do it. But, I can't see myself needing a lung transplant. So they obviously, laughed under their breath and went, yeah, another one. And I basically deteriorated from there. Over the next 2 years, I was under the health and care of the Vanderbilt Lung Institute, and literally, as you didn't know, and so many of our friends and dear colleagues and whatever and family, we just didn't say anything to, because we didn't know ourselves, and we just didn't want to cause chaos, in our families by just saying, "Hey, listen, this is what's happened," and we didn't know. All we knew was that someone had said, "You've got 3 to 5 years to live," and so therefore. 2 years in after that, that was looking pretty close. At the end of it, late 2022, in October, they said it is getting worse. And so we want to have your permission to put you into pre-approval, pre-programming for acceptance into the lung transplant situation, by which time I was kind of going, yep. I was on oxygen 24/7. If I went out anywhere, I had to have a portable oxygen tank with me. So I was pretty sick at the end of 2022. At the beginning of 2023, I went into the Vanderbilt pre-approval process for acceptance onto the lung transplant list. And I would not wish what people go through on anyone. In my experience. And my experience is different than anyone else's, but just the pre-approval process, which took for me over 12 weeks, was brutal, was absolutely, utterly brutal in terms of all the testing, all the diagnosis that you have to go through, injections, all the scanning. I had everything checked from, and most of this was checked from the inside. So it's like everything from head to toe, basically. And so I had more cameras down my nose and my throat, and and little cameras in my veins, and my heart checked and my lung checked, and things called nuclear tests. And they're brilliant at keeping you up to date with everything that you have to go through, but you have to pass the approval process before they will put you on the list as being acceptable to the transplant board for transplant. And then once you're on the list, you basically wait for a suitable donor to become, for donor lungs to become available. And then it's basically, it's toe to the metal. And you're in hospital very, very quickly, and your transplant happens within 24 hours. It was an incredibly tough first half of 2023. It sounds unbelievable, but in all the tests and all the processes that I went through for pre-approval and for acceptance, which Alicia was with me every step of the way, including blood draws, when they you take the blood out of you and fill up, myriads of vials for twice weekly blood testing and stuff like that. It totaled over 500 different procedures
my God.
in 6 months. And then I have to say, that does include blood drawing. So there was like 270 vials of blood drawn out of me in that 6 months. And my record for number of vials at Vanderbilt labs is 42 in one sitting. You do wonder, you sit there and you go,
how do you have enough, right?
Where's this coming from?
Yeah.
I'm now 4 months post-transplant, but just this week I've been in again. I have to go in now just once a week. Yesterday, they took 10 vials.
And you have to maintain a anti-reactionary drug from now on, right?
Anti-immunosuppressants. And there's 4 of them that I have to take for the rest of my life.
Do you know from whom you received?
Not the name. And that whole thing about donor lungs and things like that is a very interesting topic of conversation, because what we do know, and what Alicia found out about my donor, is that donor organs are not gender dependent. So, it can be, and I received the donor lungs were from a lady who passed, who was between 34 and 45 years old. So that's all I know. I know that she was a lady of that age. And after 1 year post-transplant, we're allowed to contact the donor's family and have that kind of connection. But they're very, very protective, and quite rightly so. I've had the question asked about, how do you feel? Is there some psychological, barrier or thing that you have to go through with regards to knowing that you have donated organs in your body? And I think it's anything from kidneys to liver to heart, lungs, or whatever. But we've had tremendous counseling with regards to the fact that I'm alive because someone passed away. And I think that the thing that really touches Alicia and myself and my family is that anyone who hears what you're doing and has anyone that's involved in a transplant, a lung transplant or whatever, the thing that really got us through it was to understand from the very beginning that to be a donor is a decision that someone incredibly kind and decent and loving has made themselves. And so you must respect the fact that they had the bravery to be a donor and the willingness to be a donor, to give life to someone else. And therefore that puts a different complexion upon how you view that person and not the circumstances, but certainly the reality of what their family are going through and what they've endured and how their demise came about. We've got another 8 months before we can reach out and just write to the donor family. And we can't write direct. We have to give the letter to the American Donor Association, Lung Donor Association. They're very, very correct and proper and respectful as to how that is all handled. And consequently, it's up to the donor family if they want to reach out and meet the person it was donated to. So we're praying that goes goes fine. But it's important, I think, psychologically, because I've seen a number of people really suffer from the reality of death and life and death. And so you've got to be able to deal with that psychologically. The sad thing for me is that, you know, one of the things that also happens after you're transplanted is that you cannot drink alcohol again for the rest of your life. You know, so I'm having to deal with all this shit on my own.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question. Has it changed how you see life, firstly? And secondly, I'm curious, I'm sure everyone has asked you this, but have you developed any new food likes or dislikes or any kind of thing that seems separate from you, but now of you?
Well, I'll never be able to eat a Hawaiian pizza again in my life. So that's a real bummer, because I love Hawaiian pizzas. But I'm not allowed to eat certain things or drink certain things. Not allowed to eat pineapple. Not allowed to eat real salty things. I'm not allowed. I've been banned from sushi. And I loved drinking wine. And my wife and I enjoyed our life of traveling and socializing and whatever. But literally last February, I think it was Dr. Norfolk at Vanderbilt was explaining that, you know, as of the end of March that year, I had to have no sign of alcohol in my system, or I wouldn't be accepted onto the pre-approval process for transplant. You know, by the beginning of March, April, you won't, you know, just have your last glass of wine, because you can't have any show up in your tests. So literally, it was February the 28th last year, and I remember it as clear as day. I was standing in front of the refrigerator. I just said to Alicia, "That's it. You know, if I'm going to have to stop at the end of March, I might as well stop now." You know, and so that was it. I haven't had a drink of alcohol, wine, or anything ever since.
Have you developed any weird cravings?
No, but I really should ask that question. There's nothing that I'm eating that I could say that I didn't eat before, or it has manifested itself as an increased craving or something like that. The one thing that it did do is the fact that I lost so much weight. I mean, I lost 48 pounds in a year. The one thing they did do is kind of make me a bit crazy about, you know, making sure I was getting food and I was adding on weight and whatever. Primarily because I did get so close to the cutoff line, and that freaked me out. And also, I saw myself, and I thought, you know, I looked like I'd been chopped in half. I became perhaps a little bit more obsessive about, you know, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I've got to cut back on that now because my cholesterol's gone up and I think I've eaten too much pudding.
How do you see life differently, if differently at all? I mean, you've always had a joie de vivre and a true light in your eyes. Has anything shifted at all for how you see life?
Not really, because I've always had this Irish attitude of life as being an incredible gift, you know. And I can't remember who said it, but it was, you know, I spent billions of years being dead, and I've only been alive for a very short period of time, but those billions of years had no effect upon me whatsoever. So I'm alive now, so I'm going to just, you know, love it and live it. And I've always had the attitude, a lot of it is to do with faith. I've always had the attitude that it's such a gift. It's just to be alive, you know, and I don't mean to be standing on top of the mountain preaching at anyone, but if you think about the chances of just being alive, just the whole process, the idea of me sitting here today talking to Susan Ruth, you know, and in these circumstances, all the things that have had to happen in history for this to happen, no one can tell me that faith doesn't play a part in that, or that destiny doesn't play a part in it. And so I've always been of the attitude that there is a destiny. I'm God-led, and things happen for a reason. I've been asked about what I remember about the actual surgical process and whatever, and the answer is basically nothing. I basically went in after Leisha and I receiving the phone call that they had donor lungs. I was literally in the hospital within 3 hours. They had to wait until the lungs were tested to be an absolute match for me. And then once that process was done, they filled me full of happy juice and I was gone. And I literally smiled my way into the operating theatre because, as God is my witness, my view was, I'm either going to come through this and be back with Alicia, which is brilliant, or I'm not, and I'll be in heaven with my mother and my sister. So it was, I kind of, the whole process of the surgery, I've never asked any questions about or anything like that, but I do remember at some stage, and I don't know what day it was, but I remember kind of being in some ethereal floating mist somewhere and thinking to myself, well, if I can feel this, I must still be alive. So, because I didn't know where I was, but evidently I was trying to come out of anesthesia myself. But they put me to sleep on the evening of September the 2nd, and I woke up on September the 4th. Unless something goes wildly incorrect or wrong or something, you don't feel it, and I don't remember having any instinct coming out of it other than I made it. It
must be incredible to take a deep breath now.
Oh, that was it. That's the other question was, what was your first, feeling? It was I could breathe without having this little motor beside me. And again, I have so much to thank my darling wife for, because she basically, gerrymandered the oxygen machines in the house so that I could get oxygen at full amount wherever I was in the house. I was just so grateful to get through and come out the other side. And then, they stick you in ICU for a little while, and then they get you on your feet as soon as they possibly can.
And look at you now.
Yeah. And I was in Vanderbilt for a month, and how incredibly talented these young nurses and caregivers and physical training people, the whole recovery unit, just amazing young people. And they were all dedicated and talented. I had the most extraordinary, I think Alicia would agree that we both had the most extraordinary experience being cared for, both as a patient and as a caregiver.
You're so lucky that you had that privilege too, because many people don't. And I cannot even imagine the costs of such procedures. Hopefully your insurance was exceptional.
Well, the insurance was amazing, but also, I lucked out at the fact that I'd gone past the age of 65 when this happened. And so I had Medicare. Bear in mind, when they first diagnosed me with IPF, they put me on an anti-fibrotic drug called OFEV, O-F-E-V. And it is a drug that is designed to slow the process and the development of fibrosis, and an immune suppressant drug to obviously suppress the immune system so that the other drugs would work. But just in that 18 months, 2 years, up until the testing period started, pre-transplant, those drugs were costing nearly $14,000 a month. And thankfully, the majority of that was covered by our Cigna, Medicare, and the Vanderbilt Trust. So it's, we were very, very lucky. But the cost, and I don't think I'm talking out of tune, because you can research this online, but the cost of my double lung transplant from literally, and this is only from the end of August up until now, is over $1.8 million.
Wow. Jeez.
It's an extraordinary undertaking, and of course, people argue one way or another whether that's a responsible or an irresponsible or a whatever cost, because there are places in the world that you can get it a lot cheaper. And me, I'm actually, because I'm a green card holder, US resident, but I'm also a British citizen. So, if push had come to shove, I could have gone back to England and got it under the National Health Service, but I may not have survived the wait for that.
Does any of the money get given back to the family who provided?
I don't know. I think there is some form of support system, but I have to be honest, hand on heart, we've never asked that question.
It would be interesting because if, for example, I said, donate my body to whomever, and then my eyes went somewhere, my heart went somewhere, whatever, that my family might get some of the compensation out of that gigantic chunk of money. It would be interesting to look into that.
It would be a very good question to ask. And I think that the thing is, you can't hide the truth online now, even though you can find as many untruths as you want. But
sure.
At the same time, you can research things like that and get pretty. I researched how much it cost myself because I was fascinated. I thought, there's so many different amounts that are bandied about. The research that I got tallied almost to the $100 to the summary of the bill paid that we got from the insurance company.
Yeah, I had surgery a couple of years ago that when the bill came, it was 30 pages thick. It's crazy.
Well, it's jaw-dropping. It is, when you look, when they itemize it and you realize it's just extraordinary, really. But
I'm so glad that you're here and you're alive and you're healthy and you've got new lungs with shiny shoes on them. And for those of you wondering about the pineapple, I believe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, things like pineapple, grapefruit, all these can be counterintuitive to medicine, and that's probably why. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have a big book that they send you home with a big file book. And it has a lot of do's and don'ts and do's and don'ts and do's and don'ts. And you think it's all too much information until you get 3 months into it and you realize that it is vital, because
absolutely.
You pick yourself up. So, it's now, Alicia's always saying to me, I don't read enough books. Well, I've now read this one 3 times. So.
Well, again, I'm so glad you're here. I adore you. I adore Alicia. Please give her my love. And I really appreciate you sharing all of this.
Oh, I'm more than happy. I just think that for me, it wasn't even a frightening experience. It was something that I think once you realize that something terminal is happening in your life, then I think it's not grabbing onto anything. It's basically, I'm going to go for life. I'll do everything I can. I may not make it, but I'm going to do everything I possibly can, and that's what keeps people strong.
Yeah, amen to that. I love you.
I love you too, my dear. It's so good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you too, and thank you for listening, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Rate, review, and subscribe to Hey Human Podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks. Bye.